In this introductory Photoshop lesson, we're going to talk about several tools in the tool panel that work in concert with one another and actually help support one another in their functions. We're going to talk about the paint bucket tool and the gradient tool, which are grouped together here, and also the eyedropper tool, which allows you to select colors, and it changes and works with your foreground and background color seen here on the toolbar. We're going to select a color and fill it with the paint bucket tool. We're going to explore gradients, and then we're going to actually use one for blending to a background. The eyedropper tool is used to select a color in the picture window, and then we're going to find out what the color sampler tool does in concert with the info panel. So let's take a look. So the paint bucket tool is pretty self-explanatory. It works with the foreground color in filling an area in the picture window. Let's create a new layer and fill that layer with the foreground color and using our paint bucket tool. Now I can mix a foreground color by just clicking once on this panel, and it brings up our color picker. And I can move around and mix different colors until I get something that is satisfying to me. And maybe I'll choose kind of maybe a light green. Click OK, and once I've mixed my color, you can see that it changes the foreground color, and then in my new layer I can click with the paint bucket tool and it fills that entire layer with that color. Now this image here that you see was created using the paint bucket tool, a luminosity blend applied to a layer, an eyedropper to select a color, and then a gradient to blend the background color to transparent, to somewhat obscure the background image so that I could apply text. Let's take a look at how this was built. So if I turn all of these options off, I can show you the original image started here. What I did was use the paint bucket tool to fill this layer with color. So let's turn that on. The next thing that I did was I actually duplicated the original layer and I changed its blending to luminosity. Luminosity keeps the original image's luminous quality or light, but it actually picks up the color behind it. So that's kind of a fun little trick using your layer blending tools. So using the layer blending options, I created this luminosity layer. And the next thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to fade that image back so that I could apply text on the left-hand side. And I did that using the gradient tool. So let's turn this color back on, create a new layer, and take a look at what the gradient tool does. With the gradient tool selected, I can actually choose from a variety of stock gradients. And if I click and hold down my Shift key, that it constrains that gradient to a straight line. If I don't, I can make it go at any angle depending on which direction I click and drag. And I can have it change light to dark or dark to light depending on which direction I move and I click and drag with my cursor. So there's a lot of interesting options here. You know, some of them aren't necessarily attractive options, but they do give you some basic stock options here. You can create your own options by just changing foreground and background color. And then you can choose this element here fading foreground to background. You can choose that gradient. And so you can kind of design your own gradients depending on how you configure that foreground and background color. So now that we've done that, how does this apply to our image in question? One of the options in your gradient tool is foreground to transparency. In my drop-down menu here for the gradient options, this one is foreground color to transparent. Right now my foreground color is blue. But in this image, the foreground color is this black color. How did I achieve this effect? I used the eyedropper tool to select that new foreground color, and then I choose the gradient tool. I make sure to select this option here, which is foreground to transparency, as opposed to foreground to background. Foreground to transparent. And then I can create a new layer. And I click and drag, holding down the Shift key to make it go from left to right very smoothly. And I can do that a couple times until I've sufficiently obscured the left-hand side in order to add my text. So that's kind of a neat little handy trick that you can use for multi-layered images in which you need to kind of show and hide something or somewhat obscure a background image. Let's look a little bit further at some of these tools. The paint bucket tool, you can choose a varying opacity of that tool. And then the tolerance level is between a range of 256 colors. How much do you want to fill? Now this is one color, so if we click, it's going to do 53% of the foreground color, which was black. But if I try to do the same thing to our original file, and I select that layer, and I click now with my paint bucket tool, it has a tolerance of 200 and the opacity set to 53%. All that did was sort of tone down this glow effect. And it's only going to select all of the contiguous colors, or all the pixels that are side by side. So you can get some kind of weird results depending on where you click in an image. And it's not always ideal. So you kind of have to experiment, sort of see how that works, and maybe change your tolerance level from low to high. And see how that changes. 1 is not a very high tolerance, but 250 is pretty high tolerance. Changing the opacity to 100% completely obscures the image. So there are quite a few different options available to you in the paint bucket tool. Let's take a look at some of the options available in the gradient tool. You have different types of gradients. You have round gradients. Let's choose a more attractive color to blend this green with. And we're going to do blue to green, rounded gradient tool, center to outside, outside to center. And notice how things change as I click and drag depending on the size of my line that I make by clicking and dragging the cursor on the stage. Now what happens when I toggle foreground and background? I get different kinds of effects. And as I move that cursor around the picture plane, I get a variety of the round gradient. And we have sort of a cornered style gradient where when you click and drag, that line that you create on the stage with the cursor becomes a very hard edge between the two colors. And this goes from one color to a middle color and back to the original color. You can see the differences, but it makes a nice gradient, a nice smooth gradient, maybe used for something that's got kind of a rounded edge to it. And notice the difference between starting from the center, holding the Shift key down, to just covering the entire page. So this one creates more of a starburst effect. So there's a lot of options available to you with the gradient. You also have all of the blending options available, the same blending options that are available on your layers panel. And you can reverse it without swapping your foreground and background color by simply clicking reverse. So I encourage you to sort of explore and play with the gradient tool and the paint bucket tool on your own and just kind of see what sort of interesting effects that you can get. Now if we go back to our original panel, we've applied the luminosity filter or blending to this layer. We've created a foreground color to transparency to somewhat obscure that background image. And then I just used a simple text layer to put on top of that for this demonstration. Now the other thing is the eyedropper tool can on its own just select colors, and it changes that foreground color to the color that's selected. What kind of yellow color is there? So it samples colors throughout the picture plane. If we turn this layer off and bring up the original layer, then we're going to get a variety of different colors. I'm going to turn the text layer off and show you one other thing that's rather interesting. The Color Sampler tool, when used in conjunction with the Info panel, can actually give you little hints so that you can remember colors that you may want to use again. So, for example, if I wanted to use a text color that was similar or would match one of the yellows in this panel, I could use the Color Sampler tool and the Info panel to click, and it'll display the RGB equivalents of that sampled color. I can sample another color over here, which we used for that foreground color. So that's sampled color number 2, which is black, 0, 0, 0, and maybe a color from here. So every time I click, it's going to give us a sample color readout in the Info panel, which is helpful if we want to refer back to those colors again at a later date. So this kind of concludes your introduction to utilizing the gradient tool, the paint bucket tool, the eyedropper, and the color sampler, and shows you how they can be used in concert to create a variety of different effects. Have fun experimenting with these tools. They are infinite and wonderful tools.